Up until 1996, when Nintendo unleashed their three-pronged beast into the wild, most controllers followed a safe yet iterative design principle. 4 rectangular bits indicated by arrows family to 2 or 4 or 6 or however many buttons implanted in a plastic shell is what we envision when someone says the D-pad. And for the most part, it's almost always been that way. We've almost always had a cross-shaped D-pad. We've almost always had a jump button and a shoot button. They've been housed by rectangular plastic or curved plastic, but they seem to stay on the left side of the controller. Companies who were brave enough to stray too far from this familiar design by including too many buttons like this, or thinking this was a good idea, met a terrible fate. When we think of Nintendo, we think of the NES controller, a rounded NES controller, or a weird tri-legged controller, but we think of them all having that same iconic D-pad. Intended to be used with the handheld version of Donkey Kong, the D-pad was created by Nintendo's Gunpei Yokoi. It was introduced to the NES in 1983 and has maintained its form and function for over 30 years. 5 years after that, we were introduced to a D-pad sort of reminiscent of the Steam controller's D-pad on the 1988 Sega Genesis. This brought a simple yet effective change to the familiar input method. The Sega Genesis D-pad is what most refer to as the pinnacle of controller design. At the time, platformers and fighters reigned supreme. Sonic, Contra Hard Corps, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, Street Fighter 2, Vectorman, Castlevania Bloodlines, the later Mega Mans, and who could forget Earthworm Jim? The Genesis D-pad was committed to delivering a precise gaming package to millions around the world. The perfect D-pad wasn't really synonymous with the Sega Genesis until the 6-button controller came to be, and the stiffness that was associated with the 3-button controller was mostly eliminated. The Genesis 6-button controller was excellent for fighting games, and some would argue a regression, rather than progression, in D-pad design over the last 28 years. It wasn't always this way though. The 6-button Genesis controller went through a ton of tweaks and changes over the years. I mean, there are so many different variations of these things. I got lost when researching the differences in the model numbers for controllers that had completely different build qualities. There were 3-button and 6-button variants, model numbers like the MK1653, SJ6000, MK1470, the MK1470 again. It's no surprise Sega went all in with their Genesis add-ons either. Stacking all these additional CD drives and expansion slots makes it look almost like the Tower of Babel, but maybe that's why it was called the Genesis? Anyway, D-pads are important to a lot of people. Professional fighters take controller construction so seriously that they'll wrap towels around their hands to dampen the sound of their preferred pad, and that's ridiculous. To me, anyway.
I remember when Al was here, he was putting a blanket over his hands to make it more quiet.
I've always been a casual gamer, but I've always marveled at the thought and criticism that pros place on controller construction and design. They obsess over the materials used on the A button, how much force is required to unleash their super. They take every element of a controller and try to use the advantages to their benefit. So here we are with the Steam controller. It's 2016 now. Everything people have known about the D-pad has been thrown out of the window. Nobody has used something quite like this, so there's no wondering why so many have challenged my stance that the Steam controller's D-pad is a progression of D-pad design. Out of the box, this thing is tough. It's tough to press, it's tough to feel the indentions, and it's tough to get used to. But customization is king, and the Steam controller's D-pad reigns supreme. Setting a comfortable dead zone and turning off the requirement to click will turn an otherwise hated input method into a beloved one. So how well can this stack up to a D-pad found on your PS4 controller, or your Xbox controller if you prefer? I've been playing a fair amount of platformers lately, when I'm not playing Stalker or Bloodborne, so I thought this video might serve as a mix between anecdotal and pseudo-scientific findings when using the Steam controller's funky D-pad. The first suggestion made to me to compare D-pads with was Super Meat Boy. I was able to navigate through Super Meat Boy's levels with relative ease. Well, ease for me, I'm still bad at platformers. I never once thought about where my thumb was on the pad, I just let the flow of the game dictate how I'd move my on-screen character. Air stopping, last-minute corrections, everything was natural, and I was able to perform these moves in a way that I expected to with the standard D-pad. I don't finish a lot of single-player games, and I'm not sure I'll see the end levels of Super Meat Boy. That's not to say I don't enjoy it, because I do. Especially that soundtrack. I played the last 5 levels in the first world 5 times each, switching between the Steam controller and the Xbox controller. My first runs were with the Steam controller as indicated by the left side of the screen, and the second runs were done with the Bone controller. I was worried that playing with the Steam controller first would be practice runs, warming me up for using the Xbox controller, but in hindsight, this might be the best way to compare the two input methods. Use the challenging input method first to prove its worth, and then match that with a more familiar device. This isn't conclusive evidence that one is faster than the other, but it just goes to show that the Steam controller isn't left behind in the blood trail. Is the Steam controller's D-pad better than an Xbox's? With this test, I wouldn't say it's better, but that doesn't mean it's worse either.